Hello, I am so excited to dive into Isaiah 40, the first 11 verses, and to talk a little bit about weaving into Second Isaiah and what that means, what that meant then, and what that means now. So we're going to explore the world in front of the text. So, what do we feel when we read the text? What does this mean to us here? We're going to talk about the world of the text, like what do the words on the page actually mean to us? We'll talk about the world behind the text. So, what's going on at the time the text is written, and what sort of information do we need to have behind the text in order to place this in context? And then we'll come back to the world of the text and see how any of these insights might inform how we apply this to our lives. So, the first thing we want to jump into is the world in front of the text. We want to contextualize ourselves. So, the first thing I notice when I read through all 11 verses is this is such a kind and comforting God. This is just what we need in this particular time with all that we're going through here sitting in 2025. I also think an exilic people need these words. Um, and I think that within the text, there is praise and honor and hope and gospel in the sense of the good news. I love thinking about prepare the way of the Lord. I hear the God spell happening in my head. But then as I read, I'm wondering, why do they have to change the physical landscape? What does that mean? There is a significant amount of time spent here about changing the physical landscape, lowering, raising. And why are we doing that? And what does it mean to cry out and to whom? We hear this word cry, I think, throughout the prophets and throughout Psalms. And I want to explore, and it's not always translated as cry in every translation of the Hebrew Bible. So I want us to kind of take a look for a second at what it means to cry out. So, in order to do that, I want to take a look specifically at the text, what the words on the page tell us. My first impressions when I look at the text are that it begins with an imperative: comfort, comfort. Oh, comfort my people, says your God. So, it's second person telling someone to comfort, comfort. There's also this beautiful metaphor of flesh or people to grass, depending on which translation you're looking at. So you're comparing the bodies of people to something that's also of God's earth. There's also this beautiful metaphor of the Lord as a shepherd, which is repeated throughout throughout the Hebrew Bible. And there's a personification of God. So there, God is speaking. God has an arm that he reaches out across. And then again, the metaphor of the shepherd, which is, of course, a human. So there's really like bringing God into humanity. I do want to look at, like, within the world of the text, I want to contextualize this and say, who is our audience? And in order to do so, I was really lucky to read a chapter of a book called The Crisis of Israelite Religion. The chapter is called Second Isaiah's Coping with the Religious Crisis by Marjo Corpel. And Dr. Corpel notes that the prophet who is commonly designated as Second Isaiah or Deutero Isaiah lived among the exiles in Babylonia, but his message was also directed at the sorry remnants of Judah still living in Palestine and suffering under Neo-Babylonian oppression. So these are an oppressed people. They're either exilic or they're stuck in a place where they're being oppressed. So now we want to look at some of the differences in translations. And like always, I looked at the NRSV and JPS because I feel like um, it's really helpful because these have essentially two different audiences, as well as two different perspectives to look at the slight differences that happen here. So the first, um, the first thing I wanted to look at is where it says, "Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her." This is in the NRSV, that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid. And in JPS, the second part reads that her term of service is over, that her iniquity is expiated. So what does it mean that the term of service is over? So there the subject is term of service. The subject in NRSV is she. So what does it mean for the agency there? And what's happening? Like, is someone serving it, or is it just like an arbitrary service sentenced upon someone? Then I want to look at verses 4 and 5. So there's a difference here in the use of shall and let. So in NRSV, it says, every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. And the uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all the people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. JPS varies these. It says, let every valley be raised. Let the rugged ground become level, and the ridges become a plain. And all the flesh, then it changes. The presence of the Lord shall appear, and all the flesh as one shall behold, for the Lord himself has spoken. So if we think about this in terms of like the end of a sermon in many of our churches, let us go forth and do such and such versus we shall do such and such. There's a difference in urgency there. And then next, there is a piece in the NRSV in verse 5 that says, then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. And in JPS, it says, the presence of the Lord shall appear. And glory to me is much bigger, it's brighter, it's more vibrant than the presence of the Lord. Let's see, moving on, verse 6 in NRSV, a voice says cry out. And in JPS, the voice says proclaim. And we're actually going to look at this word a little bit more in our word study. Talking about the metaphor, in NRSV, people are grass, and in JPS, flesh is grass. I didn't do a word study on this word specifically, but in looking at it in a cursory manner, flesh seems more accurate. You're talking about the body. And I think that's really critical when we're sort of talking about bodies and souls and how that metaphor works. That here, I believe the prophet is talking about someone's body. Their constancy is like the flower of the field versus their goodness is like the flower of the field. And I kind of just want to know more about how goodness and constancy play together. Next, the word of our God will stand forever, or the word of our God is always fulfilled. So there's a continuousness happening in JPS, always fulfilled. It's constantly happening. We don't know that it's lasting forever, but it's continuing to happen. Whereas in NRSV, the word of our God will stand forever. So one, it's in the future, not in the present like JPS, and it's finite. Insofar as something forever can be finite, but it will stand forever. It's not that it's constantly changing, but it's going to happen and it's going to stand forever. And then the last piece that was interesting to me is the way that Zion is placed in the last next verse 9, so towards the end. So in NRSV, Zion and Jerusalem are the subjects. O Zion, herald of good tidings. O Jerusalem, herald of good tidings. And in JPS, Zion is the object. O herald of joy to Zion. O herald of joy to Jerusalem. And this is something that I've seen in a number of our hermeneutical circles, where sometimes things are placed as a subject in NRSV, an object in JPS, or vice versa. And to me, that really changes the meaning. So it's something I kind of want to learn more about, the way Hebrew grammar is working and why these translators might have chosen to sort of place these in different places. Okay, so now we'll move on to the world of the text, our word studies. So the first word I wanted to look at is nihum, comfort. Obviously, the text begins with these words. They're big. They're, like I said, they're commands. So BDB Complete just defines nihum as to be sorry, to console oneself. Concise Dictionary of Classical Hebrew defines this as comfort or consoling someone. And then the Theological Lexicon of the Old Testament from Westerman and Jenny, I learned more about kind of what the stem was, what stem this was in Hebrew. So it looks like this is using the PL stem in Hebrew, which I learned was intensive or causative action, as opposed to Nepal, which would be to let oneself be comforted. So this stem, the PL stem, is used most often in Isaiah. So it's used 13 times in Isaiah as opposed to 2 times in the new Paul stem in Isaiah. And this PL stem is used 6 times in Psalms, Job, and Lamentations, so less than half of the time in other books. The TLOT says that this commonly means to comfort. Beginning with the oldest text, the subject is a person and the occasion is a death. And then it goes on to say that there are also less specific reasons for this sorrow, but that the comfort transpired largely in fixed rituals. So we can see that this is saying use one of your existing rituals to comfort someone. It also says that such comfort intends to be more than a well-meaning but unengaged address. So this is a really active thing, which we can kind of tell from the stem, right? So this is the comfort that it says penetrates to the heart and that thus becomes a reality. So it's really more than like a pat on the back. It's a really active form of comfort. So then the next thing I want to look at is sin. And the reason I want to look at this is because of the way that it's translated in JPS. So the verse reads that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. Um, and it's sort of like, is she receiving a punishment for her sins? Like, what does this mean? Um, and BDB Complete not only defines this as a sin, but as a sin offering. And then Strong's also talks about this as an offering. Like the first definitions it gives are an offense, penalty, occasion, sacrifice, expiation, which, okay, that may be what she's receiving from the Lord's hand as a punishment. But then it also, again, notes that this could be a sin offering. And then in the OT Word Study Dictionary, again, it notes sin offering. It does note that the word denotes youthful indiscretions in Psalm 25, evil committed against another in Genesis 50, trespasses against God in 2 Chronicles 33, Psalm 51, and Amos 5, a general state of sinfulness in Isaiah 6, and a specific occasion of sin, particularly in reference to idolatry in Deuteronomy 9 and Hosea 10. But then it also goes on to say that it also implies an antidote to sin, including purification from ceremonial impurity, the sacrificial offering for sin, and the punishment for sin. So um, as we see those who are being addressed sort of move from condemnation into reconciliation, we can kind of think of this word sin as not just something you've done wrong, but something that you are creating an offering for. And then finally, oh, sorry, actually, I have another one after this. I wanted to look at tenderly, so speak tenderly to Jerusalem, because when I like moused over this word, it looked like it really meant heart, something inner. And BDB Complete does define it as inner man, mind, will, heart. OT Word Study Dictionary describes it usually rendered as heart, but whose range of meaning is extensive. So it can mean like a physical human heart, like a literal heart or an animal heart. But OT Word Study Dictionary says it usually refers to some aspect of the immaterial inner self or being, since the heart is considered the seat of one's inner nature as well as one of its components. And it can be used in a lot of different ways, and it is used in a lot of different ways. And then it also says, and I think this is especially relevant in the context that it's used here, where we're talking about speaking to a people. The OT Word Study Dictionary says because the OT does not usually regard human existence individualistically, it can discuss not only the leib of an individual, but also of an entire group. And then finally, for word study, I wanted to look at this word cry, like I mentioned earlier when we were looking at the comparisons. So here it says in verse 6, a voice says, cry out, and I said, what shall I cry? It's also used in verses 2 and 3. So BDB Complete defines this as call, proclaim, read, and it notes that it means to read aloud, to recite. The TLOT gives extensive information about this verb. It says it's only rarely used of animals and almost never in a figurative sense. So the basic meaning, it says, is apparently to draw someone's attention with the sound of the voice in order to establish contact. And it also says in prophetic literature, it becomes a technical term for to proclaim. So to me, cry out might be like when you hit your knee or when you lose a child, like it has some emotion, like you're crying out with pain or anguish. But really what I'm reading here is that it's to proclaim, it's to tell people, it's to read something out loud. So I'm not sure how NRSV came to decide that cry was the word that it needed. Okay, my favorite, the world behind the text. So when we look at Second Isaiah, there's this overarching theme that Second Isaiah really needs to square up some theology in Scripture that doesn't seem to comport with the historical experiences of the day, like exile and captivity. So the prophet here has a pretty big job um, that both chapters 40 and then 55, according to Corpel, who I referenced earlier, he says contain evidence of some important switches in the theology of Second Isaiah as compared to various established theological concepts of the pre-exilic period. So as we're moving from pre-exilic into exilic, um, the prophet is facing new theological challenges. Moving on to a different source, to Zelig Astor, who I will provide a complete citation for at the end, notes that the opportunity to return to Zion offered by the declaration of Cyrus will set in motion a divinely directed process of return. This highly innovative argument required the prophet's audience to accept the idea that the actions of Cyrus, the idolater, were part of a divinely guided plan. So not only are you saying like, okay, I know what you heard earlier said you weren't going to be in exile, you weren't going to be oppressed, that you have this covenant, everything was going to be good, but actually things have shifted, but all of that is still true. We just need to change our lens. But it's also saying like you can accept this idolater's um, promise because it's all part of this bigger plan and this bigger covenant. And then we have some other questions. So has Zion fully repaid her debt? Is this a transactional relationship? Um, and there are some things that both Zelig Astor and Corpel note about what's been written previously about this debt or this term of service. And Zelig Astor says that the term of service is clearly Jerusalem's period of subjugation to foreign powers. Why does the prophet need to proclaim the end of this term, emphasizing that a specific term existed, the end of which has been reached? So the idea is that at this time, people were thinking that there was a specific term. And Zelig Astor even notes that it could have been a 70-year period of exile. He says that it's entirely likely that traditions about this period circulated orally or in written sources that are no longer extant. So he doesn't necessarily mention where it's written that there's a 70-year period, um, but that there is a predetermined length. And obviously, 70 years haven't fully passed between 597 and 587, the declaration in by Cyrus in 538. So if they were thinking it was 70 years, it's not, but he does need to address that it's a predetermined length because this is probably something that folks are thinking at this period. Um, and then Corpel kind of goes less technical, but says like Second Isaiah is addressing here the theology of lamentations, a theology of merciless retribution for past sins. And then he says that essentially the people of Zion say, quote, enough is enough. The double which Zion has paid for her sins seems to match Jeremiah's prophecy that God would repay his people double for their iniquity and sins. And he also mentions that this is sort of a reference to the compulsory work that prisoners of war had to do. And he gives the reason for the optimism of that, like, this is a repaid debt, found in the unbreakable nature of the covenant between God and his people. And so then, where are the Judahites going to return to? Like, what about the temple? There's no temple. Like, this was also supposed to be in the temple. So Zelig Astor says, it is not necessary, argues Isaiah 40, that Yahweh returns specifically only to the temple. Rather, Yahweh's return is made manifest by the Judahites' resettlement of Judah. And he also says that verse 4 describes a road designed with human convenience in mind. So God doesn't care if there's a valley or a mountain. But Zelig says that this is clearly implying that the ones who are to walk on it are the returnees. So this is clearly a road made for them to return regardless of the presence of the temple. And he also says that Although Judahites may be fixated on God's return to the temple, the prophet argues that the announcer of Jerusalem should not announce God's return to this edifice. Instead, the announcer should announce God's return to, quote, the towns of Judah, who are to be told, behold your God. Behold your God, not your temple. We've talked about the sort of things that are movable, the Sabbath, um, keeping kosher, like what sort of rituals are movable. The temple is not, but we can bring ourselves and our God back to this place in a post-exilic period, which hasn't happened yet, but will. So then the question is, how are you going to make this happen, Zion? Like, what's your next step? So Corpel says that even though the prophet is referring to the Exodus for the first time here, he does so in terms totally different from the well-known passages describing the Exodus. But he says it's important to prepare the Israelites um, to do preparatory work. And he says, quote, if they are courageous enough to make a start, miracles will happen because the Lord himself will take over. And then he goes on to say, speaking about Isaiah 40, verse 9, that, quote, instead of remaining seated in the dust, nourishing her grief, Zion has to climb on a high mountain again. In contrast to Zion, Babylon will have to sink down into the dust. Again, we note the emphasis on the active role Zion itself has to play in meeting God's salvatory work. End quote. So this is a covenant. It is a relationship. It is not a just here you go. You have no responsibility, and it's also not a transaction. Right. So now we'll return back to the world in front of the text. What I really want to note here is that this is not the prophet twisting the words or recontextualizing what was previously promised by God and saying, oh, just kidding, guys, it actually changed. So, what the prophet is doing is showing how this is a prophecy. It's not divination, it's not soothsaying. The prophet is sort of gently correcting the previous interpretations of what had already been written in the Hebrew Bible, specifically here in what I've talked about in Lamentations, by asking the people of Zion to re-examine what they have taken from these, otherworldly texts and made concrete and human and of this world, and asking them to re-examine those and note that it's not 70 years. It's not the physical temple. This is talking about something bigger. The prophet also clarifies that the very most important thing here is God's covenant, and that it cannot be forgotten or forsaken either by God or by God's people. And then finally, the prophet must bring comfort to God's people, because that's what the prophet has been charged by God to do. So these are my citations from the two authors that I referenced, whose book chapters were extremely helpful. And this is way over time, but I had a lot that I wanted to say about it and a lot that I wanted to dig into. So thank you so much for listening this far. Thanks.